And that is my cue. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome everyone, welcome community, welcome faculty, staff, and students. Welcome to Ostos Community College. Welcome to Ostos Community College, where our mission is to provide access to education through intellectual growth to achieve socioeconomic upward mobility. Welcome to Ostos, where we live to serve and where we relish in the foundation of our Hispanic and Latinx heritage and traditions. Welcome to Ostos, where we dwell in diversity and materialize our multiculturalism. Welcome to Ostos, where we put people first, where trans lives matter, where women's lives matter, where brown lives matter, and where Black lives matter. I'm your dean for the day. I'm Leslie King, and thank you for joining us for another Balada Ostosiana, a Ostos Culture Talk. So I want to take care of a couple of housekeeping items here today. I want to be sure that everyone is aware that this event is being recorded and that that closed captioning is available on the screen, usually down at the bottom. And I want to talk to you all about and talk is the key word today, because we're going to be having a conversation. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. John Wesley Johnson, Jr., who comes to us by way of St. Peter's University, where he serves as an assistant professor of history. Dr. Johnson earned his master's degree in history, as well as his PhD in American Studies at Rutgers University, Newark. And I believe that's also, that's his hometown as well, Newark, New Jersey. So there's going to be more to get to know Dr. Johnson. We're going to get more acquainted with him in a few short moments. But first, I must call upon someone who is not only a distinguished academic and a scholar, but also a poet and a philosopher. Most importantly, she is a staunch advocate for our community and an unwavering proponent for higher education that prioritizes the needs of students first. Please welcome our leader and president, Dr. Daisy Coco de Filippis.
Thank you, Dean King. I have to say, this is a very, very generous presentation of my achievements. I am very grateful to you for the respect. I am so glad that we were able to put this program together with your leadership. And I am really delighted to welcome Dr. Johnson. I want to say that my youngest son is also a PhD from Rutgers University. So there's affinity there as well. And I'm so happy to have you also. As I began to glimpse at some of what your presentation would look like, I see the Spanish Caribbean there, I see Cuba, a little bit of, and I'm reminded of my younger days where I actually lecture on syncretism, cultural syncretism and religious syncretism in the Caribbean, where the African presence is so strong and felt. Ostos takes great pride in celebrating the strength of the college, which is our diversity, which is our position as a place where opportunities are created and supported for our students who never really disappoint us. I'm really, really happy to see SGA President Brian Carter joining us, who will bring remarks on behalf of our students. And I am absolutely delighted that Madam Chairman of the Higher Education Committee of the council member or councilwoman, depending on the preference these days, Inez Barron. I met her and we had a lovely chat a few weeks ago. And I opened and extended this invitation for her to come join us whenever her busy schedule permitted it. You honor us, madam. chairwoman. So happy to have you. And please feel free to come back to Ostos as often as you like. And we will promise you that we will continue to offer the kind of programming that would entice you to leave things behind and join us for a little bit. So thank you. Bienvenidos todos, colleagues and students, and bienvenidos to this conversation on the very rich Black heritage. And it's amazing, the more we begin to fill the missing chapters with young, talented, and I say young because I just told you my son also graduated from Rutgers, and I have feelings about your age as well, Dr. Johnson, and colleagues from other institutions coming. I'm just so delighted that we could have you, and hope that you come back, and hopefully at a time where you can actually feel the sense of warmth of the campus itself. So mil gracias, everyone, for being with us. And thank you, Think King, for taking this initiative. I'm very, very grateful to you.
It's certainly my honor, Madam President. Thank you so much for your words today. I want to segue into this wonderful treat that we have today. You mentioned Council Member Inez Barron. She comes to us as a representative of the Brooklyn District. Her areas are Canarsie, East Flatbush, as well as East New York. She's been a member of City Council since 2014. And prior to that, she served on the State Assembly for 5 years. She was a public school teacher for 36 years, serving our students. I have such great reverence for teachers. They are the salt of the earth. And she also is a CUNY alum from Hunter College. So I suppose welcome home. And without any further ado, I present Councilmember Barron.
Thank you so much. It's certainly a privilege, a pleasure, and an honor to be with you on this program today. I want to send greetings to President DeFilippis and to all of the members of the campus and the students that are here. As the president said, we met briefly about maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and she invited me to come, and I'm glad to be able to just give you some greetings as we look forward to the keynote speaker. I'm excited to hear what he wants to say. I just want to say briefly that our great historian, John Henry Clark, said, if you start your history in slavery, everything looks like progress. If you start your history in slavery, everything looks like progress. So we know that it's called Black History Month, but we need to go back to Africa and we look at our origins. The origins of all humankind start in Africa. And we need to always hold on to that. Because if we start in slavery, and if we start with thinking that Christopher Columbus discovered America, or if we hold that false notion that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, we're going to be in a world of trouble. If we get that notion that we were docile, happy, enslaved people, that's a bad situation for us to be in. So I just want to encourage our students to be confident, to be comfortable with who you are, to be knowledgeable, and to challenge and confront the injustices that you see in this system. So I'm looking forward to our speaker, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. Thank you. God bless.
Councilmember Barron, thank you so much. We really appreciate that. Fake news is not brand new. It is certainly a thing of the past. And we are today going to honor that rich history that hasn't had the light shined upon it as thoroughly as it should be. So, but before we get to Dr. Johnson, because I know we're chomping at the bit, I want to present someone who represents our most vital and valuable resource at Ostos, and that's our students. I want to introduce our president of the Student Government Association, and that is Brian Carter, who is a rising junior and a rad tech major who comes to us from Harlem, New York. I know we've met briefly over the phone, but it's really good to see you virtually, President Carter. So welcome.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy Tuesday. I just want to. Okay. No, I had two devices working at the same time. I just want to thank you for acknowledging. Okay, now, thank you. Sorry, that was a little embarrassing. I just want to thank everyone for acknowledging me as the president-elect, and I would also like to thank my previous administration for all their hard work and effort in these trying times we have experienced thus far. I completely understand and fully accept my responsibility going forward. I'm excited about this responsibility and opportunity for this upcoming semester, in which I plan to follow tradition. And being a Black man, as you know, it's no excuses. We all have challenges, and this semester has been very challenging for most, if not for everyone, going forward. But I continue to lead by example and just set the precedence for uplifting and encouraging and motivating people to, you can be great no matter what color you are. It's no color barrier. Like as far as my eyes see, I see 2020 just like anybody else. So this is upsetting sometimes when you have to discuss matters like Black Lives Matters, because it's like we all exist in the same world. So at the end of the day, it's very powerful that we finally came to the forefront in society, and being acknowledged and being accepted is great and everything. But I want to be the reason why this conversation keeps going forward, because it's quick to forget after all the conversations died down and all the protests died down. But we're not going to let it die down, because this is the situation that we're involved in the first place. And I just want to, I don't want to take up too much time, but I just want to thank everybody, and I look forward to this wonderful workshop, and I look forward to many more workshops of this sort, because we know we all family at the end of the day, and we can't keep acting like we gotta combat each other in every type of episode of life. I'm all about uplifting and bringing love to this world, so I just want to try to set that trend. Thank you.
President Carter, thank you so much. Your point is well taken. Love and togetherness. That's what we do here at Ostos, and we appreciate you leading the way on behalf of our students. So I'm gonna get into a quick note about the history of Black History Month before we get into our presentation with Dr. Johnson. I want to talk about, some of this history, some of this tradition that isn't promoted enough. So I want to be sure I touch on it. I want to talk about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who is known as the father of Black history. He was born in the year 1875, and he began his formal education when he was almost 20 years old. In 1912, he became only the second African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard. The first, of course, was W.E.B. Du Bois in 1907. Throughout his studies and research, Dr. Woodson noted that the study of African-American life and history was often not considered an important factor in the history of America or the world. In 1915, Dr. Woodson founded an organization now called the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History. By 1926, Dr. Woodson initiated the celebration of Negro History Week, which corresponded with the birthday of Frederick Douglass. In 1976, 50 years later, this week's long celebration extended into the whole month of February, which is why we have now Black History Month. Today's discussion is derived from this year's annual theme from the Association for the Study of African American life and history, the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. So in keeping with that theme, Dr. Johnson's presentation and discussion today is titled, My Cousin, Tu Prima, the Black Family, and the African Diaspora. So without any further ado, I present to you Dr. John Woodson, Jr. I'm sorry, Dr. John Johnson, Jr. I'm bestowing additional history on you there, Dr. Johnson.
I will take the kinship with Carter G. Woodson for sure. I appreciate that. I want to thank everyone, thank the Ostos Community College for sending out the invitation and offering me the opportunity to come share with you today some of my thoughts about the Black family. First, I want to send a thank you to Diane Kramer for ushering me through this digital space and making the opportunity to come here that much easier. Also, Clifton Pierre and his assistance in this process. Thank you to Dean King. We have a mutual friend, and it was one of those peculiar things as life goes, you lose contact with people for well over a decade, but it's always a good thing to reconnect and to build, you know, in the efforts to not only make ourselves better, to make our communities better. And so it's great to meet you again, brother. It's good to see you. I'm also glad to share this virtual dais with Dr. Coco de Filipilis, the president of the college, who just in the brief conversation we had, I got to know a lot about where she's from and her history. And a lot of that is part of my story and the reason why I wanted to talk about the topic that we're going to discuss this afternoon as well. Councilwoman Inez Barron, I do appreciate you giving me an assist in terms of opening up the possibility to talk about the African diaspora in ways that treat slavery not as the end point, not even as a beginning, but just a transition. And so I do thank you for that. In addition, student president, Brian Carter, you know, you got a great responsibility, and I'm sure the students at Ostos Community College will be better served for you. So, you know, all the best to you and your work.
Dr. Johnson, if you please, I would like to add a quick note.
Sure.
I want to remind everyone that as you're presenting today, they should feel free to submit any questions they have by using the Q&A icon down at the bottom of the screen. And additionally, I want to remind you all that today's discussion is being recorded and the closed captioning is provided at the bottom of the screen as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. So the title of today's talk is My Cousin Tu Prima, the Black Family in the African Diaspora. That picture there next on the slide is myself and a beautiful songstress, singer, artist, formerly known as La India. She's now India, a salsa singer who her idol growing up was, sorry, I taught 3 classes today, so I just drew a blank, Celia Cruz. And so, you know, I have this interesting fan relationship with La India. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, as Dean King mentioned before. If you know anything about Newark, Newark is a house music center, a house music mecca. And invariably, La India was playing on the speakers. And what I heard in the box, what I heard coming from the speaker did not match up with the person that I would eventually see initially in the picture, then have the opportunity to meet at a music festival. What was interesting growing up and listening to her music was I didn't put 2 and 2 together. Like so many things in life, you go through life, say, convening with your family, talking in, say, the ways in which your folks talk, whether it's in Spanish, whether it's in English, whether it's some form of Black vernacular, one way or the other, you connect and you don't understand the historic significance of it. And in so many ways, listening to La India and her music on Masters of Work with Louis Vega, and, you know, Puerto Rican brother who was very much in love with African music and the music of the African diaspora. And it didn't really occur to me the significance and the beauty of it in the larger world, especially when historically people of color, Black folks, Latinos, Latinas, have been disparaged, oppressed, minimized for capitalistic purposes. We can't lose sight of the fact that slavery was a system geared to extract labor from peoples of color with the effort of making some rich and continue to keep particular groups in poverty and struggling in order to maintain that wealth. But through it all, African-American people were able to create facets of culture that sustained us, and indeed are some of the leading bodies of art for the world. And so it's important to recognize those particular things and the connection that we had, even across nationality, that links us. Hence my cousin to prima. In a way, we're all country cousins, and I want to explore that topic today. I appreciate Dean King going over the history of Carter G. Woodson, and so that saves me a little bit of work. But I do want to point out one of the ways in which Woodson talked about Black History Month, because what so often happens, we think of Black history as just this long list of firsts, right? You know, the first person, the first African-American to go to the moon, or the first African-American to become president of the United States. We always think about it in terms of these lists of firsts. But Carter G. Woodson had something else in mind. He was focused mostly, particularly on using history as a means of uplifting and bettering one's predicament, of retelling the narrative so individuals can imagine a better present and a better future. That it wasn't simply a matter of telling stories for the sake of stories, but that they had political utility. And one of them, and I want to read the quote real quick, so bear with me as I'm reading the slide, but Woodson says, quote, "One of the many reasons for the success," talking about Negro History Week, "is that the association has convinced most of the thinking public that this celebration, like its other efforts, tends not to promote propaganda, but to counteract it by popularizing the truth." So Dean King had mentioned, you know, the fake news that's out there. I mean, white supremacy has been around for a very long time, and that has been the great lie, the big lie that James Baldwin talks about, and that Eddie Glaude Jr. in his most recent book, Begin Again, talks about the big lie of white supremacy, this notion that whites are superior to Blacks, right? Negro history Negro History Week was developed and thought as a means of pushing back against that big lie, against that propaganda. Itself was not propaganda. It was not trying to preach Black supremacy, but it was seeking to correct the narrative. He goes on to say, it is not interested, Black history or Negro history is not interested so much in Negro history as it is in history influenced by the Negro. To clarify that, he goes on, for what the world needs is not a history of selected races or nations, but the history of a world void of national bias, race hate, and religious prejudice. There has been therefore no tendency to eulogize the Negro, nor to abuse his enemies. Here's the rub. The aim has been to emphasize important facts in the belief that facts properly set forth will speak for themselves. In order to appreciate where we are as a group of people and how we got here, we have to have the facts. One of the reasons why I became so interested in history was I was interested in Black history, but as I got deeper into my studies, as I pursued my master's and PhD, I realized I was really interested in change. What created change? I'm an urban historian, and so I became fascinated with why highways are built through certain communities. I'm from Newark, and Highway 78 cut through the community that I grew up next to. Those that live in the Bronx and parts of Queens and Brooklyn know what it is to have, say, the Cross Bronx Expressway or 278 or various other highways cut through those communities. And they weren't there all the time. They were built there with a particular purpose. They were placed there because they knew it would displace a particular population, and they were able to use those highways to connect Manhattan and other urban centers around the 5 boroughs to the outer boroughs, to the suburban communities, right? The changes that occurred to our communities were intentional. And so one of the studies of history, particularly Black history, is to get to the truth of why we're in the position that we're in, why we're in the space that we're in right now. One of the other things I became interested in also, and in addition to changing the city, was also changing culture, in particular music, where we're talking about musical genres like jazz and house music, and the ways in which people from different nationalities are able to get together and create something beautiful. I was just watching a video of Dizzy Gillespie talking about how he was introduced to Afro-Cuban music and the ways in which he had, he's from South Carolina, country boy, and how he was able to make the connections with the Afro-Cuban music, and how, as he said, he felt like he was at home when he was in Cuba. And that resonated with me, right? And we think about the ways in which Afro-Cuban music has been a fixture in American music for so long. Well, part of it, we have to look at how those relationships came together. And so that's what I want to look at for today. And thinking about us as country cousins, I want us to reimagine Blackness in the Atlantic world. To think about the Atlantic Ocean not as just this body of water that separates continents and nations, but as a meeting space, a place of convergences where African peoples connected with indigenous peoples. And we can't ignore the fact that there was European interventions as well. But all of those things came together to produce some of the beautiful things that we all create, listen to, and take part of to this day. I want us to reimagine Blackness. And to do that, I want us to start with music, to start looking or listening to and watching two facets of Afro-diaspora culture. One that represents the call and response, which is part of Afro-diaspora culture, but also the idea of the coro pregón, which also means call and response. I want us to listen to the lyrics. I want you to pay attention to the cadence and the rhythm. Pay attention to the way folks are moving around, because all of this, we have to look at it in totality to appreciate how we are country cousins.
Yes, sir. We gonna live and never grow. Be glad.
to just go a little bit further for the sake of time, and I hate to cut that off. Like, this is what's needed on a Tuesday afternoon. Man, I love watching this, but there's one part that I want to get to that, you know, to me is kind of the high point. I don't know if you know about that whole at the end of the day, when there's nothing else to be said, all you can do is just wave your hand. But in a lot of ways, that encapsulates so much of the Black experience, right? As a kid growing up, you know, my mother was Yosemite, South Carolina for summers, and so every Sunday we would go to Hopewell Baptist Church, my granddaddy's church, and this is the way they sang. Church I went to in New Jersey, up this way. You know, they played a lot of instruments and, you know, hand clapping, and there was a guitar and organ, and it was very loud. But when I went down home, it was pared down. It was really just basic, but full of life and spirit. And so I was exposed to this. And again, I wasn't aware of the larger historical context. I wasn't aware that these were the same songs sung by my ancestors. I wasn't aware of the fact that they sung it in this manner, often in spaces not like a church, but possibly out in the field. For those that unfortunately found themselves in a chain gang working hard, they did the labor to that rhythm on the chain gang, where you had a leader singing out a message, sometimes improvising, making things up as he went along to match the crowd. And then the larger body around him would respond in kind. I didn't know the larger significance, the historical significance of that, but I just knew it was beautiful. And as I got older and, you know, started to see a little bit of the world, traveled to different places, my familial circle expanded a bit more. And I met some brothers and sisters from all over the diaspora. I realized that we were engaging in some of the same practices. And so one that I want to share with you comes from Cuba. And let me be 100% clear, fake news and all of that stuff. I don't want to lie to you. I do not know much Spanish, but I do get the feeling from the music and I can identify with it. And so please don't assume that I know Spanish. I just want to make that very clear so we can avoid any embarrassing things down the line. But I feel this music, and I want you to listen to the call and response in this as well.
Si quieren tomar por refresco ron, alguien va a tomar ron.
Caminar por los
Whew, I'm gonna let that simmer a little bit. If you were dancing, you can get your rag and, dry off a little bit, sip some water. A few things to note before we move forward, and it's important to do this, right? One, we heard the call and response. You had the song leader uttering something, uttering a lyric, and then the group responding accordingly. Sometimes they repeated the lyric over and over again, and sometimes they changed it up. There was the improvisation. And then there was also opportunity for other song leaders to come in and take over and then lead the group as well, and then the group respond accordingly. And while they were speaking different languages, one was in a spiritual, and I'm very hesitant to use that because in a lot of cases, the ring shout is both secular and spiritual at the same time. But let's just say one is in a church setting, and then one is folks hanging out in an alley, chilling and relaxing. It still has the same basic fundamental pattern, right? The call and response, the presence of a circle of sorts where one person is at the center and they're leading, but the group is also following in accord and they're listening to one another. And the rhythm carries itself throughout both songs, throughout both renditions. This is in essence a linkage of sorts. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same, they're not, but we see the roots of both, right? We're witnessing Afro-diasporic culture. And so that leads us to a particular historical question, right? Right? When our ancestors were carted and hauled onto ships, packed in tightly from the various parts of Africa, some of them, when arriving at the shore, speaking different languages that were reflective of their particular regions, of their particular clans that they belonged to. Did they lose something when they were forced to migrate to the United States, when they were forced through the Middle Passage to the Americas? Did African peoples lose their culture and history? Another way of asking that question is, do we see diaspora, the idea of dispersion with the sense of a homeland? Or do we see Gutal, the idea of dispersion in exile? And this really speaks to issues of, this speaks to matters of, say, Jewish culture. If you look at theology and the history of Judaism in particular, the idea of the Jews being dispersed in exile first by the Babylonians, and then eventually by the Romans, and whether or not they have a homeland or they're in exile, they're totally cut off from their culture. There's this question that has been presented to peoples of color and Black peoples of color, and that is, have we experienced lost, or do we actually have a homeland, and do we have roots in that homeland, right? And generally speaking, the way the narrative has been told since the 19th century has been one of exile, that there was either nothing in Africa, or that the process of enslavement got rid of that because we lost our language, or because we lost our name, and because we lost our homeland, there is exile. But history has shown us that there was not exile, right? That we actually do have connections, that African peoples were creative enough, diligent enough to be able to preserve culture. And so real quickly, I just want to present a few ways of thinking about this historically, so we can really see where some of our kinfolk may be from. The fact that historically, some of us may have passed by one another, God forbid, to think about it, in a slave ship or on a plantation or at a port of trade, that somewhere or another we may have connected at certain points, but as life goes, we were dispersed and went to other places. Nonetheless, there is a connection there. We note that there were regions in Africa where people were captured, from West Central Africa, the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, from all these various places. And this lets us know the significant place, the percentages of where folks came from. But we also know where a great many of our ancestors landed. Some of them landed in South America and Brazil, some landed in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is a very large place, as we know, between Cuba, San Domingue, Colombia, Puerto Rico, Cuba. There's so many different places. There's also, of course, the Americas, as we know. But oddly enough, and interesting enough, there's also a Mexican and Central American port of landing as well for African peoples too. And so we all found ourselves in different spaces, in different historical contexts. And as our peoples emerged and grew into different nationalities, and we claimed national heritage, there was still the roots of where we came from. And it's important to note those particular roots. It's important to note how the Atlantic Ocean was a means of convergence, right? Because for all intents and purposes, say in a small town, say San Cristobal in Dominican Republic, you may have had people who have ancestry that trace back to West Central Africa, but then also to the Bight of Benin. That's just the way it worked. The slave traders, they intentionally mixed up our people so they couldn't speak the same language. But what they weren't able to appreciate or see was the fact that there were these common linkages, that even though Africa is a very broad and large place, that there were these common threads that allowed people who spoke different languages, who had different heritages, to come together to form a culture. The scholar Lawrence Levine, in his book, Black Culture and Black Consciousness, tells us, quote, scholars must be receptive to the possibility that for Africans, as for other people, the journey to the New World did not inexorably sever all associations with the Old World. That with Africans, as with Europeans and Asian immigrants, aspects of the traditional cultures and worldview they came with may have continued to exist not as mere vestiges, not as just these offshoots, but as a dynamic, living, creative parts of group life in the United States. And I would add to that the Caribbean, South America, and even parts of Europe. Culture is not fixed condition, but a process. It's important to remember that. Culture is not fixed, but it's a process. It's constantly being reinvigorated and changing, right? The product of interaction between the past and the present. Its toughness and resiliency are determined not by a culture's ability to withstand change, which indeed may be a sign of stagnation, not life, right? People that want to make America great again. No, it's about change. But by its ability to react creatively and responsibly to the realities of a new situation. Culture is dynamic because it changes. Culture is beautiful because it's changing and it is constantly going through these developments, right? I don't use the term evolution because evolution suggests that the past was bad. No, it suggests that there are these changes and these changes are necessary, right? As we move through time. Very quickly, the term that we give to this common culture between peoples of the Americas is the ring shout. And the scholar Sterling Stuckey wrote an extensive and just beautiful narrative of the origins of the ring shout and how it manifests itself in the United States. I would suggest, and I would recommend to those that are interested, to look for aspects of the ring shout and various other aspects of African culture throughout the Americas, right? Throughout the Caribbean, South America, and such. Stuckey says the final gift of African tribalism in the 19th century was its life as a lingering memory in the minds of American slaves, right? We have to remember that as people were brought over, they still remembered their homelands. They still remembered the cultures and the traditions of their villages and the folks that they were connected to, even though they were separated. That memory enabled them to go back to a sense of community in the traditional African setting and to include all Africans in their common experience of oppression in North America. According to Stuckey, they were able to make a new national identity predicated on these African roots. And so whether it's in the Dominican Republic, whether it's in Venezuela, Colombia, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in South Carolina, folks were able to create community based on these African roots. And my suggestion here for Black History Month is that we recognize those roots, not just in terms of their nationalist origins, right? Where we are right now, or where your kinfolk are right now, but how it connects us across those national boundaries. How do we see the circle expanding to include not just, say, African Americans, but also my brothers and sisters from other places, other nationalities as well. One of the things that's important to note is the idea of the circle. And this is something else that Stuckey explores. And very briefly, I know time is of the essence, and I want to hear from you all too. I want to field your questions. I want to talk a little bit more with Dean King about some of these ideas. So I just want to press forward a bit. Stuckey also talks about the idea of the circle being an important symbol for the performance of the ring shout. As we saw in Cuba, there was the circle of folks around there who were able to see one another as they were singing to one another. And invariably, folks got up and got in the middle of the circle and danced around in the circle, often in a circle, right? Circle is an important figure. But as Stuckey notes, and looking back at the anthropological evidence, it's not just the simple fact of a circle, but it's the movement of the circle. And so this video and the song speaks to that tradition. This is a church in South Carolina, Charles Chapel Primitive Baptist Church. And I've seen this type of ceremony and practice in my grandparents' church. Wherever in Africa the counterclockwise dance ceremony was performed, the dancing and singing were directed to the ancestors and gods. The tempo and the revolution of the circle quickening during the course of movement. The ring in which Africans danced and sang is the key to understanding the means by which they achieved oneness in America. So it's evident that those particular practices weren't lost. Right? To be sure, they were placed upon a Christian framework of Christianity, right? That the songs took on the meanings of Christian ideology, but oftentimes it transformed those as well. And so Christianity wasn't a religion to, say, suppress revolution or to suppress people's desire to be free, as the enslavers, those that led the Second Great Awakening, would hope for, right? They thought that religion would make the slaves more docile, the Africans more docile. But what it actually did was gave them a means to talk about their liberation, talk about their desire to be free. Right? And so whether we're talking about, say, Nat Turner, who had a dream, who was a well-read preacher, whether we're talking about Denmark Vesey, who used the biblical word to suggest that Black people should be free, inevitably, it was African culture that transformed Christianity in the Americas. It made it a liberating force. Lord, I hate to cut that off. That sounds so good. I do want to draw things to a close, and I want to do that with some reflections on, again, my own family, my own history, in a way, and I hope that encourages you to think about your own history and your own families as a means of better appreciating the African diaspora writ large. As I noted before, my folks are from South Carolina. That's my grandfather on the trellis right here. That's my cousin sitting next to me, my cousin Toddy. She's a professor over at Fordham now, Fordham University. And then the picture on the right is my grandma. Both of my grandparents have passed on. They've gone to glory. They've gone to be with the ancestors. But the interesting thing about them is that they were very much connected to those African cultures. They used language that my middle school teachers, my elementary school teachers didn't use. And so one particular occasion, my grandmother used the word Buckra. Oh, Buckra, I can't stand him. And I didn't know what she was talking about at the time at 4 and 5 years old, but as I got older and started reading books like Sterling Stuckey's, I realized Buckra was the word used to refer to white people. And that was a word that was derived from parts of West Africa to describe white folks as these ghost-like individuals, right? Because of their positions as slave traders, as slave purchasers and the such. And so herein is this little old lady, born in Rembert, South Carolina, traveled to Philadelphia at 15 to work, and then eventually came back down south and married Marion Pinckney, right? Channeling channeling this culture for me, exposing me to something that, again, I didn't have the historical understanding to appreciate. What I found fascinating as I got older, though, was that as I went through school, the ways in which my grandparents talked was often maligned, was said to be bad English. I was told that I had to get rid of that way of talking. And as I went through different social and political circles, I realized that even the ways in which my folks worship in church wasn't looked upon highly, right? It was something that we should not do. And I find problems with that. One of the things I think is important to highlight is that as we go through the processes of education, and some of you may desire to be teachers and educators yourself, it's important to value what students bring to the table. It's important to value what they bring with them, because that's what sustained them, that's what sustained their ancestors. And even though majority society would think otherwise or would suggest otherwise, it's important to cultivate and preserve that history. To be sure, culture changes. But more than that, it's that culture that gives us a sense of where we're come from. It helps us have a truer sense of who we are. And as long as we tell the truth of our existence, I think that gives us some ability to deal with white supremacy and racism and various other forms of oppression that would suggest that we are lesser than other people. One of the beautiful things of going to Rutgers University when I did during my undergrad was I was able to connect with students of various backgrounds. You know, I'm a Yankee, my folks are from North America, right? But a lot of my friends are from the West Indian Student Organization, right? I joined that group in my sophomore year because I was interested in their culture and their history. not just going to the parties, but knowing the political history in Jamaica, knowing the political history of Trinidad and why you have this interesting mixture of both African and Asian peoples in this one particular place. And WISO allowed me to gain that understanding. As I went on through life, I was able to connect with the beautiful family, the Guerrero family, who are from Dominican Republic. And so I was able to become part of their family. They are essentially mi familia, right? Suhai, the sister in the middle, who's holding a little girl, Mia. Mia's father is Jonathan Johnson. He's no relation to me, but again, this is a beautiful example of what can happen when people have an appreciation for each other's culture and don't necessarily allow those barriers like nationality to keep people apart. But one of the beautiful things I love talking with Suhai and Jonathan about is the ways in which they vibe and talk about the commonalities of their ancestry, where their folks are from, right? And that growing up in San Cristobal and some of the things that folks dealt with there, in a lot of ways is similar to what folks went through in parts of Alabama where Jonathan's folks are from, right? They had Trujillo in DR, and Jonathan's folks had to deal with Bull Connor and some of them folks, right? And so it's important to note the ways in which we've experienced white supremacy. But more than that, I think it's important to note the ways in which we've been able to connect through our culture and those roots in Africa. In closing, I just wanted to put on your radar certain books that have helped me think through some of these ideas that I've discussed with you today. First and foremost is Sterling Stuckey's Slave Culture. Again, an exploration of the idea of nationalist theory, the ways in which people form their national identity based on their African roots. A recent book, Yamira Figueroa Vasquez's Decolonizing Diasporas, in which she looks at the connections between Puerto Rico and West Africa through artistic developments. Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, again, is one of those theoretical explorations of the connections between Africa and the Black Atlantic, mostly through England, black folks in England and Black folks in the Americas. And then Michael Gomez is Exchanging Our Country Marks, which looks at the ways in which African peoples preserved their history and culture through slavery, even up until the 1850s. And so these are, for me, essential readings to look at some of these topics. And then the last thing, again, just to kind of point out that, what I'm talking about is not really new. It's stuff that's really been going on for a long time now. And there's a way forward, and there are ways of exploring this on your own. I want to point out Arturo Schomburg, who was of Puerto Rican and German ancestry, who was a part of various nationalist movements in the Caribbean, but became a major proponent in the collection and preservation of African-American history. The center, the Schomburg Center located in Harlem, is named after him. And so he was doing this work decades before I even came onto the scene, even, before I was a twinkle in my mama's eye. The other thing that I want to put on your radar, and again, these are opportunities, I'm interested to see what unfolds from this, is that the University of Puerto Rico is creating an Afro-diasporic and racial studies program in which they will be having people majoring in the study of exactly what we talked about today. And they're looking to create partnerships with various institutions to create some of these programs. And so even when we're in the midst of a pandemic and an economic crisis, which sees a lot of universities shutting down, closing, even cutting a lot of their humanities programs, I think it's vitally important that we preserve these and find ways of preserving these bodies that do the work of exploring and telling the truths of our histories. And so with that, I say thank you for the opportunity to share just a little bit of the beauty of Black history.
Wow. Wow, Dr. Johnson. I don't know if we should take questions or if we should just keep singing. Oh, I saw the light. Very inspirational. In fact, let me get into some of these comments here and questions. I just want you to hear some of these thoughts on the music and the way it moved, folks. Babette says, I got chills watching this. The percussion is so fully embodied and embodying, hard to resist and not get carried along with this. And to know these words, melodies, and rhythms have echoes in a long past. We have folks simply saying, I'm so happy right now, wepa, amazing. And then we get into some additional questions. And another comment I want to that I think is important here from Marino. I'm very excited to be able to witness this amazing talk. As a Dominican born and raised in PR, I always look for things that make us similar. Black heritage seemed to be the common denominator. Traveling the Caribbean, the Yoruba traditions are embedded all over. And he asked, have you ever done any research into the importance of the drums from the mainland Africa?
Personally, I have not looked at that. I mean, just as a connoisseur of music, as somebody that loves music, you know, you hear the drum. I wanted, I don't know if folks have done this, where if you've, you know, in COVID times, I can't remember the last time I've actually partied with folks, right? Been to a party where there was a DJ. But I have this habit where when I'm listening to a DJ and they're actually doing a very good mix, and I just pause and listen to what they're bringing in because I want to hear the drum. I want to hear the particular kind of syncopation that's coming in, because in a lot of ways that dictates how I'm going to move and how I'm going to respond. And so to that question, I haven't done the study of drums enough to speak authoritatively on it, but just as a person that's a part of the culture. Yeah, Stanley Crouch, I don't know if you all are familiar with him, a noted speaker and cultural critic. He passed away, I guess it was last year. God bless the dead. I happened to run into him in a bookstore, and you know, it's one of those things when you meet these figures, these intellectual figures, and you want to impress them with, you know, all kinds of discourse about X, Y, Z. And I was talking about Miles Davis and basically describing Miles Davis in a bunch of different ways. And Stanley looked at me and said, like, I appreciate that, brother, but does it sound good? And I was like, yeah. And he said, that's all that matters. Like, all the stuff that you said is okay, but at the core of it is just, does it sound good? And in essence, to that point, I haven't studied the drums, but I think at the end of the day, it's just a matter, does it sound good? And what does it communicate to you? And how does it help us connect to one another? That question, I think it raises it raises the idea, or it raises the question about the kinds of music that we listen to and the connections between it. I mentioned Dizzy Gillespie before, and I'm forgetting the name of the artist that he connected with from Cuba that taught him the beauty of Afro-Cuban music. But the ways in which we hear, say, Afro-Latin jazz and what we hear in salsa music, right? And the influence on those two musical forms. And then if we expand it and think about the origins of hip hop, the origins of house music as well, and the ways in which syncopation plays greatly into that music. I mean, it's so beat driven. And the reason why, particularly like soul music, the one is more important than the two, right? Like that first beat is what gets people moving. And so I guess in a way I have studied the drums, or at least I can talk a little bit about it. It's the one and the three as opposed to the two and the four. And that's something that comes out of salsa and merengue, bachata, house music. It's like that first hit, that's what gets people going. And then it just carries you through. And so long answer to that question, yes. The syncopation is key. And again, there is the particular rhythm on the one that's important. We also hear this in the clave. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. It's that one. When you start on that one, that gets everything moving. And that's what we hear, especially in salsa music. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. It's the one. That's what in a lot of ways distinguishes African-based music from other musics. It's that first hit.
Regardless of pace, the music that you've given us today, it has certainly gotten us all moving. I want to get to a few more questions and some comments. This is so uplifting. Thank you for reminding us of our history. That's from Mercedes. This is talking to my soul. That's from Marsha. And Henry says, hidden culture is amazing to see. Yeah, we don't see enough of this, particularly the connections. How much we are connected, and in particular, how much music connects us. There's a question here from Pat Mabry in our admissions office. She asks, are you geeky? Sounds like Sounds like it. My ancestors are from Sapelo Island, Georgia, where Gullah, and she's so proud. So thank you for this presentation.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I do have some kinfolk that are Gullah Geechee. Funny story. Again, growing up and you meet folks and you don't understand the historical significance of it. I'm 5 years old and one of my like 8th cousins came over to visit my grandparents and he was talking very fast and talking. I was like, I don't know what he's saying. What is going on here? And then I stopped, and when I got back home, and I grew up in Irvington, I'm originally from Newark, but my family moved to Irvington. And Irvington was an immigrant community, a lot of folks from the Caribbean. My neighbor was a Jamaican lady, Miss Smith. And Miss Smith, she did not lose her accent whatsoever. She came to the United States and it stayed. And as I was listening to me, and then the next time I went down home and I'm listening as some of my cousin, my kinfolk from down there, and there were things, I remember listening to Miss Smith, and so it was a little easier to make the connection, like, because I was used to Miss Smith's accent, and therefore, and I was listening to some of my folks down home speak Gullah, and I was able to understand them a little bit about in terms of what they were saying. And the few times that I've gone to Charleston, I know that folks there who speak Gullah Geechee, it has a particular, the accent is very similar to what you might hear in Trinidad. And so I can't lay claim to any Gullah Geechee identity in any particular way, just because I haven't really been a part of it personally, but I'm familiar with it enough. My grandmother, she knows she was able to talk Gullah Geechee. So.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I want to, before I forget, give a shout out, particularly since we were on this topic of music. I want to give a shout out to Joe Conzo, who is, he teaches the history of Latin jazz at Ostos. He's in our audience today. Mm-hmm. I want to get to some more comments and questions. Marino, who, thank you you've been contributing so much with questions.
Chano Pazzo.
Marino says, Dr. Johnson, always remember the saying in PR, y tu abuela, ¿dónde está? Research that.
All right. My grandmother, ¿dónde está? I always get screwed up on that.
Let's see. More comments. I cannot wait to share this with my coworkers and family. Please post a list of the books.
I can do that.
Chano Pozo is the Cuban,
the artist, the drummer. Yeah.
With Dizzy Gillespie, right? Mm-hmm. Question here from Jeff Charles. What do you think of the connection between trauma and urban environments and the music that brings said people together?
Wow. I think music has always been a way of channeling emotions and telling stories. I think at the end of the day, music has been a means of storytelling. And so if you think about the urban environment, and one song that comes to mind is The Message. Melle Mel and the Furious Five is a classic in hip hop, to be sure, but it speaks to what actually happened to urban centers and what was done intentionally. I think that's it captures, in essence, what happens when societies ignore cities, right? The song comes at a particular historical moment, right? New York was a major immigrant center through the early 19th and through the 20th century. By the time we get to the 1950s, New York's in trouble, right? Economically, cities isn't able to meet its budgets. There are people moving to the suburbs, leaving the city en masse. You also have urban renewal, which is destroying whole communities, right? We think of the Cross Bronx Expressway and what that did to parts of the Bronx in terms of displacing whole communities. And at the same time, you don't see the kinds of investment to repair what was once there, right? There's no investment in, say, expanding schools. And so even though they're getting rid of school buildings, they're not building new schools. And so you have overcrowded schools. You have old housing stock where at some points in time they use lead paint and there's no remediation. And so unfortunately, Black and brown kids are exposed to lead at rates that, you know, we don't see in the suburbs because they're newly built houses, and the children suffer from that. We see loss of jobs and people living in poverty. And so we really see significant underdevelopment in urban communities. And it's important to point this out. We see this also in parts of Africa in terms of colonialism and underdevelopment. And we also see this in parts of the Caribbean, right? Where the economies are shifted to benefit Western European nations and the Americas. I mean, the whole tourism industry is predicated on catering to other folks, but not necessarily taking care of the people at home. And so we see trauma inflicted on people on a global scale, right? Peoples of color on a global scale. And music is one of the ways in which we can tell the truth of what's actually going on, right? Music is one of the ways in which people who are coming from different places and could lose that culture are able to preserve it. And so I'm thinking of Faunia Records and the ways in which the Nuyorican community was able to preserve that cultural heritage through this institution of music. Think of Motown, right? Folks coming from down home, down south, Mississippi and Georgia and Texas and other parts, and finding a place in urban Detroit and creating a musical institution that invariably catered to the mainstream, but at its root was that funk. The Funk Brothers kept the beat going. They were on the one. And so in various ways, music was a way of preserving our history, because you couldn't get that history from the textbooks. You know, most of the schools that Black and brown kids went to, the textbooks were from like the 1920s, 1930s, and 40s. They were old, right? It wasn't like the teachers were invested in teaching the history of, say, Black kids or Puerto Rican kids or anything like that. And so the music, both the popular music, but also what was sung in the homes, what was played on the radios, the records, the 45s that people had. Music was the means by which people were able to have a sense of self. They were listening to themselves. It was like a mirror, but it was a sonic mirror. They were able to see themselves and appreciate themselves. I mean, I'm thinking of these COVID times now where, if you all remember, I mean, D-Nice and Questlove and those DJs were able to get us through those early years of those early months of the pandemic, because music was the thing that gave us a sense of normalcy. And it wasn't like we were going to the clubs, or at least hopefully, unless you're in Texas somewhere, but you would hope, you know, even though we weren't together, we still had a sense of connection because of the music. And so I think music and the kinds of music that was produced was a response to the ways in which urbanism and urban development, urban redevelopment sought to undermine, to underdevelop communities of color.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. And just from a layman's point of view, and thank you for mentioning Detroit, where I grew up, and experienced and witnessed lots of trauma. And when I think about music, music has been, for me, it's been medicine. Mm-hmm. It's not only where we've been able to see ourselves, particularly when you're not able to do so in other places. And that could be for kids growing up, even in, even in their own classrooms, representation in their police departments and in their neighborhoods, their school principals. So music, I think, is particularly effective, and there's that connection to that trauma because of its healing powers.
If I can add one more piece to it, and this is a way of, I always like to throw out, make pitches for research projects for folks that are interested. More than just listening to the music, look at the companies or the companies where the music comes from. And so you take Stax Records. What makes Stax Records unique in comparison to, say, Death Row in LA and what they were producing? I mean, and it's somewhat of an obvious thing, but dig deeper, look at, the ways in which, say, we see reggae music developing in Jamaica, and the particular companies that were producing the records initially of Bob Marley and the Wailers and some of the other artists. Atlanta-based music companies, what were they producing at the time? And how do those companies reflect what was going on in the immediate community? Because we often think of music as this kind of national signifier of culture, but invariably it gets down to the local. I mean, one thing about New York hip hop, it's New York hip hop because they're talking about things readily around the city. When Lauryn Hill produced the Miseducation and the song Every Ghetto, Every City, she was talking about places I knew because she's from New Jersey. And so the music was based in her particular experiences. And I think a way of getting insight into the particular experiences of a group of people is to listen not just to the music, but also look at the production companies that was making the music. Who were the artists? What were the lyrics? Who were the producers? And what were the sources they were drawing from? And I think that can reveal some interesting narratives and insights into the particular experiences that people have in the Americas.
Dr. Johnson, I think we have time for just one last question. I do want to, we were provided a translation for Y tu abuela dónde está, and your grandmother, where is she? And I'm assuming that question has a lot to do with what our origins are, looking at our origins without more context. And a final question here comes from Joanna Gomez, our dean. She asks, Dr. Johnson, through your teachings, what is the most important lesson that you want students to always remember?
There's so many things. I don't know if there's, wow. Try not to be cliche about this. There's so many important lessons. The one I will say is this: don't be afraid to put yourself in your studies. Right? Don't be afraid to think of yourself as a subject of study. I think so much of what we know about the world starts at home. Like our first teachers are our parents. That's how we learn to speak. That's how we learn our mannerisms. You know. Say thank you. I'm a father of 3 young children, and so I'm very conscious of, you know, the kind of path that I'm leading them on. And I think it's important to be reflective on that journey. I think there is the expectation that as one goes or moves up in society, that you're expected to strip away and lose certain things. But I'm heartened to know and see from some of the folks here that that's not the case. That you can still be fully human, that you can still be whatever it is that you choose to be and still engage folks as your authentic self. That assimilation isn't the end result of upward mobility, and that the world is capacious enough, large enough to embrace a whole host of things. If there's one thing that I think my talk could suggest is that by looking at the looking at the Black experience as a collective, it might suggest that we have to lose sight of the particularities of, say, Dominican history or Puerto Rican history, Cuban history, of the African-American experience. And I'm not saying that at all. I think what's important is to maintain that distinctiveness, but also to recognize the common roots. And in order to do that, I think it's important to have a clear sense of self. And that's something even beyond like academic studies. That's just what you need in order to get through life. Because I mean, shoot, I mean, the way this world is, people will tell you 8 million things to convince you of who you are, be it an employer, be it a boo thing, somebody that's trying to get in your space. And it's important to have a strong sense of who you are, to be able to deal with what people are telling you. I think it's so important to have a strong sense of self. And for me, the academic enterprise and what I try to impart to all my students is to have a strong sense of self, despite whatever the world is telling you. That's the only way that you can deal with any number of things that are coming your way. But also it teaches you how to appreciate and to embrace others and not be afraid to do that. That you can accept difference and accept diversity and not feel as though you're losing something. Why? Because you have a strong sense of self. So I can be Christian and embrace Islam and Judaism and all other religious practices. I can be African-American and embrace the full diversity of the African spectrum, right? Have a strong sense of self.
So not only is he a professor of history, he's out here preaching too. We appreciate you, Dr. Johnson. I want to open up for our president or our councilwoman to take the floor if you all want to leave us with any last thoughts.
First of all, I want to say this is really wonderful, really, really needed. I'm going to invite you to come back. Okay, we do have a number of other activities that are not limited about the Black experience, that are not limited to just a month. So, you know, I know we have scheduled for April and May, so perhaps in the fall, come back and visit with us again and think of it. Look at, for example, and I don't know how much of that you've done, but there was a point in my youth, because I was very daring. And, you know, I was invited to give a talk. It was a Caribbean celebration at the Museum of Natural History. And so they were doing syncretism. And it occurred to me that I could talk about religious syncretism and how, in fact, in the Caribbean, in the churches, there is an African name for every one of those saints. So and folks, in a sense, were acculturated to think that people were going to church, but they were practicing African religion in multiple ways by attributing. So if you could go back to that, I don't think I have it in me to go back to that preparation that I did at that time, but it would be great to come back and talk about the sense of spirituality and how it permeates, and how, in fact, the church, in some ways, that is so much more open. There is Africa in the church and in some of the things that we do but I mean, from the actual, Santa Barbara was Ochun, and if I remember celebrating my 50th birthday on the rooftop in Santo Domingo, my friend, a poet, and they began to rain, and she would say, Ochun, don't love us so much. Don't love Daisy so much. Why are you raining so hard on this, which was supposed to be a blessing? And then we went down from the roof to her apartment to finish celebrating. And there's so much ingrained in all that we do. I am so thrilled. I am so thrilled that, there is a future. You have all these young people like you doing all of this good work. And it's important that the students know that, that it's there to be had, and a list of the books that perhaps we can have in the library that they may or may not have, that would be also helpful. And I want to say to our distinguished guest, Madam Chair of Higher Ed for the Council, Inez Barron, how lovely it was to see you, and how much we hope you come back. And President Carter Bryant, you and I had a couple of meetings today. This was powerful, and it was great that you were here to speak about the experience of our students and yours. Thank you. Of course, thinking. Muchas gracias de nuevo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam President. Do you want to take us out, Councilwoman Barron? You want to bless us?
I just want to say I've been blessed by having the opportunity to sit and to hear Dr. Johnson speak. I enjoyed it. My parents are from Pamplico, South Carolina, near the PD River. So those church experiences took me back to when I was a child. We would go during the summer and during Easter break, go down and spend that time. So that my mother calls that music long meter. So I don't know what other term might be applied to that, but my mom calls that long meter. And we certainly have a connection to our African culture and history and roots, and so many words and so many things, and so many manifestations. I don't know how many people know, but that box of chocolate covered peanuts that you buy that are called goobers, that's an African word. So we've kept much of our culture. We may not know it very boldly and openly, but it exists, and we've got to go back and find it. And I just want to encourage you to continue your work, and to the students that are here and to this faculty, be encouraged and keep working and stimulating our students. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Barron. Of course, thank you, Madam President. President Brian Carter, I look forward to working more directly with you and helping you achieve your goals of bringing folks together, bringing our students together in this community. And of course, I want to thank all of you who attended today. I'm sorry that I was not able to get to all of your rich questions and comments. Thank you so much for joining us today. And of course, Dr. Johnson, hats off to you. Thank you so much for enlightening us today. We appreciate the good word. So everyone, it is 5:04 and you stuck around. Thank you. Now it's time to go. Everybody take care.
I got a feeling that tonight's gonna be a good night. That tonight's gonna be a good night. That tonight's gonna be a good night. A feeling that tonight's gonna be a good night. That tonight's gonna be a good night. That tonight's gonna be a good night. A feeling. I got a feeling.